What do you think is the best case scenario for both sides if we were going to demarcate the line of this conflict, not Ukraine, Russia, but Russia has been saying, especially, this is a war between Russia. This is a conflict between Russia and NATO, Russia and the West. What's the best case scenario for both sides? A kind of a realistic best case scenario for both sides. And which one do you feel like is more plausible?
That's a really hard question because you have to project so far to the future because the US, NATO, they are going to try to perpetuate this proxy war for as long as possible. But I think if you want to know what's going to happen in Ukraine, let's look at what's going on in, say, Syria right now. Let's look at how that has all worked itself out. And we remember, people who have followed the conflict in Syria from 2011 onward will remember how there were ups and downs. The ups were never that tremendous. The downs were always, horrific. And we remember how at many junctures, the U.S. and its allies attempted to escalate. There were cruise missile strikes. There were air strikes. The U.S. essentially invaded and still to this day occupies eastern Syria. Turkey invaded and is occupying northern Syria. A Russian warplane was shot down by Turkey. The rescue crew to try to find the pilot that was ambushed by militants backed by Turkey. I mean, there were some very bleak moments and moments that could have escalated into a direct conflict between the U.S., Russia, Turkey, NATO, essentially, Russia and NATO. But Russia very patiently and skillfully navigated that. From 2015 onward, a lot of people at the time criticized Russia. They said, you're being too soft, you're being too slow. You should really teach Turkey a lesson. What about the life of that pilot or the rescue crew? Don't you want to get revenge for them? And it's the way Moscow thinks is revenge. The ultimate revenge is in the long term winning this conflict. So that pilot didn't die in vain. Win the conflict. That is all that matters. And if you have to suffer temporary humiliation or your short-term goals are being frustrated, so be it, as long as in the long term you win. And that's what we see. So Russia did not overreact to Turkey. And now look at how that has paid off. Now Russia is bringing Turkish and Syrian defense officials to Moscow to talk about what? To talk about ending the conflict, Turkish forces withdrawing, dealing with these proxies that the U.S. is still backing, these Kurdish forces, and benefiting Syria and Turkey, and then also obviously Russia in the process. And the result will be pushing the U.S. out of Syria and perhaps in a wider sense out of the Middle East. So we look at how long that took and all the ups and downs. I think it's going to be very similar in Ukraine. We could kind of already see that. It's not that easy to just storm into Ukraine. It's bigger than Iraq. The military was bigger, better trained, better armed, backed by all of NATO. It is not going to be something that just ends in a 3 days, as the Western media says Russia thought it would take. Obviously not. Russia prepared huge amounts of men and machines along the borders for months, building up to this. They knew this was going to be a long-term project, and so people have to be patient. No matter how difficult that might be, we have to be patient.
Right. I remember
the final outcome. I'm sorry. That's the whole question. Was the final? What is the final outcome? I think it is going to be U.S. NATO ambitions ultimately frustrated. I think there might be a NATO and a part of Ukraine that they're able to salvage and keep. But I think overall, NATO will be weaker. The United States will be weaker. Hopefully, Europe can start sliding out from under this shadow of American hegemony over the continent. And, just like Russia was patient with Turkey and now their relations have improved, maybe Russian-European ties can improve. But again, that will take a lot of time.
Yeah. And from how I've been observing this, it feels like without major changes internally in the West, in the United States, in terms of how they're pushing their policy of this permanent war situation, it feels like what could be very plausible is that you do almost have like a split Ukraine. You have the really resource-rich region that borders Russia, the Donbass, kind of having their own sovereignty, maybe not recognized because of the U.S.'s stranglehold over the UN, but recognized in the sense that it is very much operating as a kind of federation of states. While, yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable that the United States would try to hold on, that NATO would try to hold on to some portion of Ukraine and continue some kind of warfare into the long-term future. But it feels like the parity of the situation, the way that Russia is progressing, how Russia's been fighting this, it feels like it's going to become more and more clear where the advantages really reside, and that will just put more and more pressure on what I feel like could be the end game, if that even exists, because we know that NATO and the U.S. do not rest. But you brought up Syria, and I think this is a good time to transition into that situation because it is not being talked about a lot, and it's something that has huge ramifications. And one of the reasons I love bringing you on, Brian, is because you're able to bring it to the global situation, not just talk about Ukraine as Ukraine or Russia and Ukraine as being this separate development from the rest of the world. But you've been following Syria for quite some time. I've been writing and covering it for quite some time. And it feels as though there's a lot of developments. It's not just the negotiations. Huge, though. These conversations happening between the defense ministries of both countries. Turkey also just met with the opposition. Hard to say what the conversation was there. There were statements of support, but also maybe some elbowing like, hey, let's get it together because this war is not going to look the same. We might not be providing you the same support as we once were. And there's also been things happening in U.S.-occupied, Turkey-occupied Syria. Lots of attacks, especially on the Central Command. There's been a few missile attacks. No one will say where they're coming from, but it's plausible to believe that these strikes are a result of some frustrations in that range, especially given that what has the U.S. and Turkey has been participating in this too, been doing in northeastern Syria, occupying the water, the oil, the wheat, and stealing a lot of it, stealing so much that Syria is saying 80% of their oil capacity has been robbed from them and sent to places like Iraq, the Kurdish region of Iraq, and then into U.S. hands. So I wanted to ask you, where do you think this is going? Do you feel like there is peace on the horizon? Because it's 2023 now, and this started right during and just directly after the Libya calamity. There was a lot of buildup in Syria around that time, and now we're 12 years in almost, and this seems like one of the biggest glimmers of hope for peace that we've had in quite some time, given how Turkey has played Turkey wanted regime change in Syria for quite a long time throughout the vast majority of this war. Where do you think this is going, Brian?
I think my connection cut out. So I heard you talking about the U.S. and also with Turkey's assistance stealing oil and grain, and then it cut out.
Well, the question, basically all I asked was, where do you feel like this is going, given that this is, in my eyes, a real glimmer of hope? We know that Turkey has been frustrated by the way things have been going in terms of NATO. We know that there's been a row between Turkey and Sweden and Finland in terms of membership. And also Turkey has gotten closer to Russia and has done so. There's an energy hub developing, but it seems like now Turkey is seriously talking about they're talking about withdrawing their troops, lessening, if not eliminating, their occupation of Syria. And now there's serious talks possibly of Assad and Erdogan coming together at some point in the next year. Syria saying it's not going to happen before the election in Turkey. I think that's perfectly understandable why it would not happen during that period. But I wanted to ask you, where do you think things are going here? Do you feel like this glimmer of hope for peace is real and could be realized?
I think there is a possibility. Turkey, its leadership is very realistic. The idea of the U.S. coming through and Turkey being a part of whatever America's vision for the region is, I mean, that has evaporated. I think everybody can see that. The balance of power is shifting globally, and that affects every region on Earth, and it's readjusting everybody's calculation and the degree to which they have pivoted toward the West or toward the East, or I would say the West and the rest of the world. So Turkey's looking at this, and they're looking at what the U.S. is doing to Europe right now regarding Ukraine, how they're, Ukraine, obviously a proxy, but then again, so is all of Europe. They are also a proxy the United States is using and prepared to lose in the process. They don't care what happens to Europe. Europe is, well, all of these countries are part of NATO. Turkey is part of NATO. They know that is also their fate. They're going to share that fate of use, exploitation, and everything falling apart economically, politically, militarily. They don't want to be a part of that. Who would want to be a part of that? So it only makes sense that they're starting to change their position on Syria. It wasn't like it was Turkey's plan. It was their plan. It wasn't their plan. The U.S., it was their plan. Turkey was involved. A lot of what the U.S. does is they ask you if you want to be involved, but it's not really. It's like when the mafia asks you if you want to do something. Of course, you're doing it. You're doing it. They're just being polite to ask you. So Turkey is going along with this. Yes, they had their own ideas of what they would have gotten out of it, but it's clear they're not going to. So I think because everything has changed in the region, Turkey sees where it's all going, so it wants to put itself in the best position to enjoy the benefits of the outcome, which is getting on board with Syria remaining a sovereign and restoring its sovereignty over most, if not all, of its territory, and pushing the U.S. out. The U.S. is going to, because Turkey is not an obedient subordinate to the United States, the U.S. is going to be putting economic, political pressure, and also unconventional pressure in terms of regime change, terrorism. I think Turkey has been more transparent than ever about who they think are behind these bombings in Turkey. I think they have actually even said that it was the United States and their proxies. So everything is changing. And when we look at the U.S. military in Syria, we talk about these missile strikes. Iran makes long-range precision-guided rockets and missiles, and they proliferate them across the region to their allies. And so it could be anybody doing it. And if Iran was smart, they did give them two proxies to use. And this is going to put tremendous pressure on the U.S. What does the U.S. do? Do they expand their footprint in a region where they have very few allies, and the few allies they do have are allies because they have no choice, because the U.S. didn't give them a choice? And even that has changed. Like Saudi Arabia, we have to talk about Saudi Arabia. They played a huge role in the proxy war against Syria. And now we see divisions between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And again, it is the same thing. The U.S., when they are working on a targeted nation like Syria or Russia or China, the proxies that they are using are meant to pay the full cost of that proxy conflict so that the U.S. doesn't have to. And these countries don't want to pay that because it means suffering, economic instability, political, social instability. It also is a matter of self-preservation. And everyone is aware of that now, and they don't want to go along with it anymore. So the U.S. has to choose between escalating and being on their own in the middle, thousands of miles from their own shores, or admitting their limitations and withdrawing from the region. That's where I see this going, and the decision the U.S. will face.
Yeah, let's stay on this region in particular for a bit, because I do want to definitely talk about China, because China has a lot to do, I think, with shifts in this region as well politically. But Syria also met with UAE, which also had a hand in the proxy war. and even countries like Iran. There was the China Arab Summit happened. There was some interesting bustling happening, I feel like, in certain areas of the media, talking about Iran's angry at China for meeting with Saudi Arabia, but yet there's been lots of overtures by both countries wanting to ease relations between each other. So you have UAE, you have Turkey, you have Saudi Arabia, all looking at the international landscape in saying it's time to pull back from whatever we've been doing in terms of a proxy war in Syria, in terms of maybe putting all of our eggs in the NATO United States basket. It seems like that's the direction in this region. And you see Russia and China being almost like the catalyst of this, in the sense that these two rising powers have a lot to offer, and there is kind of this realpolitik happening and a shift toward a more multipolar world in this region in particular. And I find this very interesting because these are countries, Syria, Iran, UAE, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, that generally have been almost separated into camps and fighting each other. And now they're saying, well, maybe we need to come together. What do you make of all this, the significance of these developments? Do you feel like this is a major step in a multipolar world, or something else, or a little bit of a lot of different developments? What do you think about this ongoing situation emerging in this region?
I got disconnected again. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, so again, people get very ideologically minded when they look at geopolitics, and they perceive different nations as being friends, and then they're familiar with a certain period of time, like the Cold War, and they saw that these countries appeared to be close allies, and they assume that they are still close allies. I'm in Thailand. I constantly fight against the perception that Thailand is some sort of junior partner of the U.S. in the region. Couldn't be further from the truth. And even at the time, during the Cold War, and this is why I say what I do about Turkey and Saudi Arabia, Thailand was not given a choice. They were told, we're bombing Vietnam, we're bombing Laos, we're bombing Cambodia. We could also bomb you, or we could put our air base. And by the way, there's all these communists trying to kill your soldiers and police, which weren't actually communists. It's just like you have legitimate resistance groups across the Middle East, like Hezbollah, and then you have terrorists that are funded, extremists that appear to be resistant groups, but they're actually run by the United States through their proxies, like Saudi Arabia. So the exact same thing was going on in Southeast Asia. And when a country has the opportunity to slip out from under that hegemony, they will do it. They will take the opportunity. And I think that's what we see Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the UAE, and others doing. They're going to do this. This is about, you mentioned Russia and China. They're providing this alternative. That is what multipolarism is. Multipolarism is about an alternative to this unipolar world order. What is the unipolar world order built on? Fundamentally, it is built on the industry, the technology, the financial institutions that the US monopolized for generations. And now Russia and China and many other countries are providing alternatives that we can divert. We're paying into this system because it's the only system in town, but now there's a new system. Now we can invest in something else that suits our interests and that better balances power globally. It's a redistribution of power and wealth and influence, and it's balancing it out more evenly. There is no perfect ideology that will cure everything on earth. The best we can do is create a balance of power. That is what multipolarism is doing. And it doesn't take a lot to convince the leaders of all of these countries that is something they will all collectively benefit from, and also save them from the constant threat the U.S. poses. You don't do what the U.S. tells you, or you can't because your country will disappear. So then they destabilize you. They crush your economy. I mean, they were doing that to Turkey. They were even doing that to Germany when Germany was working on Nord Stream 2 with Russia. They were threatening and actually sanctioning German companies and other European companies that were benefiting from it. So this is something that I think leaders around the world, from west to east, This is something they would like to escape, and they would like to be a part of a better system that's more, that is fair, as Russian and Chinese leaders say.